Hi, class, and welcome to chapter 27, which will be on the urinary system. We just have two more chapters to go before the end of the semester. We'll do urinary and reproductive. So your urinary system is composed of the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. And the functions include storing urine in the bladder, excreting urine through the urethra, regulating blood volume, regulating erythrocyte production. The kidneys secrete a hormone that regulates red blood cell production, regulating ion levels, and also regulating acid-base balance. The structure of the urinary system, your kidneys are located posteriorly on either side of the spine between the 12th thoracic and 3rd lumbar vertebrae right there. The left kidney will be slightly higher than the right due to the right side being a little crowded by the liver. The ureter will leave each kidney and goes to the bladder, and the bladder is the organ that stores the urine, and then the urethra allows urine to exit or leave the body. The kidneys are bean-shaped, one on each side. They regulate the chemical composition of blood by regulating volume, composition, and pH of body fluids, as well as to remove waste from the blood in the process. They also help to control the rate of red blood cell formation by secreting the hormone erythropoietin, and also by regulating blood pressure by secreting renin. The general sectional anatomy of the kidney. So a kidney is divided into an outer renal cortex layer and an inner renal medulla. The renal columns will be extensions of the renal cortex that project into the medulla and divide it into what we call renal pyramids. And a typical adult kidney has 8 to 15 renal pyramids. The wide base of the renal pyramid makes contact with the cortex at the corticomedullary junction. An apex or tip of the renal pyramid is called the renal papilla, and each renal papilla will project into a hollow funnel-shaped structure called the minor calyx. Several minor calyxes will fuse together to form the major calyx, and the major calyxes fuse to form the renal pelvis. And the pelvis is what will collect all the urine and transport it to the ureter. A kidney has 8 to 15 renal lobes, and each lobe consists of that renal pyramid and all the cortical tissue immediately surrounding the pyramid. So here's a look at the structure of the kidneys: the outer renal cortex layer, the inner renal medulla layer. The renal sinus is the place where the renal pelvis will be located. And then the minor calyx will be connected to each renal pyramid. And the major calyx is where two or more minor calyxes come together. And then the renal pelvis is the central part that collects all the urine from the calyxes, and then it'll exit out of the ureter. The kidneys, two blood vessels enter and leave each kidney. The renal artery enters the kidney. It will branch profusely, as you'll learn in lab, into smaller arteries that line the entire inside of the kidney. The renal veins exit each kidney, and they will run along the same pathway as the arteries. So blood enters the kidneys by the renal arteries. From there, they branch into segmental arteries. Then they branch into interlobar arteries, which travel in the renal columns. Then at the corticomedullary junction, the junction between the cortex and the medulla, the interlobar arteries will branch into the arcuate arteries, and arcuate arteries will give off branches called interlobular arteries, and these arteries will radiate out to the cortex. So here's a look at the blood supply to the kidneys and just the branching that the renal artery performs. Eventually, it will go into the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, where filtration occurs, and then it will exit out of the efferent arteriole into different capillaries that surround these tubulars systems that creates the filtrate. And then these capillaries will eventually become veins, and the veins will exit out of the kidney kind of in the same nomenclature or pathway of those arteries. As the interlobular arteries enter the kidney cortex, they extend small branches called afferent arterioles, which will enter the renal corpuscle and form a tuft of capillaries called a glomerulus, where filtration occurs. Some plasma is filtered out of the capillaries into the capsular space within the renal corpuscle, and the remaining blood will exit the glomerulus and the renal corpuscle via the efferent arteriole. The efferent arterioles will branch into one of two capillary networks. The peritubular capillaries surround the convoluted tubules and reside primarily in the cortex, and the vasa recta is associated mainly with the nephron loop and primarily reside in the medulla. These vessels are still carrying oxygenated blood, and this is where the actual exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste material will occur between the renal tubules. More blood supply, this describes then how the capillaries will drain. So that your peritubular capillaries and vasa recta will drain into a network of veins. The interlobular veins will merge to form the arcuate veins. The arcuate veins will merge to form the interlobar veins, and the interlobar veins will merge in the renal sinus to form the renal vein in each kidney. So this just takes you through the blood flow through the kidney. Knowing this kind of correlation or proper sequence of arteries and what they branch into is important. The nephron then is the basic functional unit of the kidney. Each nephron is its own small independent filtering unit, and in one kidney there are about 1 million nephrons. From the nephron, we can see the glomerulus, which is kind of the main filtering system. That filtrate, once it's filtered out of the blood, will go through kind of into the Bowman's capsule, through the proximal convoluted tubule, down and up the loop of Henle, into the distal convoluted tubule, and then down the collecting tubule to the ureter. The nephron consists of the renal corpuscle, which is the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, a proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop or loop of Henle, and a distal convoluted tubule. There are two types of nephrons. The cortical nephrons are about 85% of all the nephrons. The bulk of the nephron structures reside in the kidney cortex, and juxtamedullary nephrons, their renal corpuscle lies near the corticomedullary junction, and their long nephron loops will extend deep into the medulla. So urine formation is formed through three processes: filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. Filtration occurs in the glomerulus, where water and solutes will move out of the glomerulus and into the capsular space. Once the fluid leaves the plasma and enters the capsular space, we call it filtrate. Tubular reabsorption are when substances in the filtrate are returned to the blood. Most water and all needed solutes in the filtrate will be reabsorbed back into capillaries. And tubular secretion is when solutes are actively transported out of the blood back into the tubular fluid to be excreted as urine. And here's just the overview of the process of urine formation, where glomerular filtration occurs, where tubular reabsorption occurs, several locations, and where tubular secretion occurs to eventually be excreted as urine through the collecting duct. The renal corpuscle is composed of the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. The glomerulus will be the capillaries, and the glomerular capsule is just the epithelial capsule surrounding the glomerulus. It has a vascular pole where the afferent arteriole enters and the efferent arteriole exits. And it has a tubular pole where the proximal convoluted tubule exits with the filtrate that has been filtered. It has two layers. The visceral layer is directly overlies and comes in contact with the glomerulus. It's comprised of specialized cells called podocytes. The parietal layer is formed from a simple squamous epithelium layer. The filtration membrane is a thin structure with three layers: the endothelium, which is fenestrated or has holes in it; the basement membrane is porous; and then the visceral layer is made up of these podocyte cells, kind of with these long legs that allow for spaces or filtration slits to allow filtrate to pass through. It's the role of the remainder of the nephron to adjust the contents of the urine, and the renal corpuscle does the initial filtration. So the glomerular capillaries are unique in that they lie between two arterioles, the afferent and efferent arteriole. Because the efferent arteriole has a small diameter, the pressure in the glomerulus is much higher than a typical capillary, and this is what causes the blood to be filtered into the glomerulus. Materials from the blood will be forced out of the glomerulus and into the Bowman's capsule during a process called filtration. The materials that are filtered from the blood are known as filtrate, And the filtrate is very similar to plasma. It's made up of water, glucose, sodium chloride, electrolytes, bicarbonate, amino acids, vitamins, which are mostly reabsorbed, and then urea, uric acid, and creatinine are mostly secreted. Plasma proteins, cell, and platelets are too large to pass through the membrane, so they will remain in the blood. Sometime if there are red blood cells, platelets, or proteins found in the urine, it's a sign of a problem in the glomerulus because those are usually too large to get passed through the urine. The juxtaglomerular apparatus is important in regulating blood pressure and contains juxtaglomerular cells, which are modified smooth muscle cells of the afferent arteriole located at the vascular pole of the renal corpuscle. The macula densa is a group of modified epithelial cells in the distal convoluted tubule that come in contact with the juxtaglomerular cells, and they act as chemoreceptors to sense any changes in solute concentration of the filtrate. The glomerular filtration rate is just the rate at which the glomerulus is filtering the blood. It's the filtrate that is produced every minute normally as blood travels through the glomerulus, and it's about 125 milliliters per minute normally, and the blood pressure in each glomerulus must be kept constant to ensure proper filtration continues. There's three mechanisms that control glomerular filtration rate. Autoregulation uses smooth muscle cells. If the walls of the afferent arteriole are stretched, it causes the arteriole to vasoconstrict, which leads to a decrease in blood flow to the glomerulus and a return to normal pressure. In the macula densa cells, an increase in blood pressure also increases filtrate, and this will lead to an increase in solutes. The macula densa then senses that change and will constrict the afferent arteriole to try to reduce blood flow and return the glomerular filtration rate back to normal. Neural regulation from stress and physical activity. The sympathetic nervous system causes the afferent arteriole to constrict, which will lead to a decrease in blood flow to the glomerulus and decreases GFR. We don't want to worry about making urine when you're exercising or fighting or flighting in the sympathetic nervous system, so blood flow is decreased through the kidneys. And then hormonal controlling glomerular filtration rate is due to angiotensin. This is triggered by a decrease in blood pressure, and it's part of the renin angiotensin aldosterone system. Juxtaglomerular cells will release renin, which leads to the production of angiotensin II, which will vasoconstrict blood vessels. This will cause an increase in blood pressure, which will increase the pressure in the glomerulus and increase the glomerular filtration rate. Angiotensin will also constrict blood vessels all over the body to increase blood pressure, and this helps to maintain normal glomerular filtration rate when blood pressure is low. And angiotensin II will constrict both the efferent and afferent arteriole, but with a much greater effect on the efferent arteriole. So this means that blood entering your glomerulus has a much harder time leaving it. This causes a backup of blood, which will also increase the pressure and keeps the filtration rate at an appropriate rate. The renin angiotensin aldosterone system is really important for controlling blood pressure and blood fluid levels. Renin is an enzyme that's secreted when blood pressure is dropping in the bloodstream to make angiotensin II. Angiotensin II has several roles. It helps to maintain sodium and water balance and blood pressure. It also acts closely with aldosterone, which stimulates the reabsorption of sodium. That also leads to the reabsorption of water, and this increases the overall blood volume, increasing blood pressure and glomerular filtration rate. It also causes the secretion of potassium into the distal convoluted tubule. So this just shows kind of the effects of this renin angiotensin aldosterone system on blood pressure and blood volume. Liver releases angiotensinogen into the blood. The kidneys release renin and forms an enzymatic reaction that creates angiotensin II. Angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin II, which causes widespread vasoconstriction of arterioles and also stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, which increases reabsorption of sodium and water, which also helps to increase blood fluid levels. The renal tubules, then, we have the proximal convoluted tubule located closest to the glomerulus, the loop of Henle, which consists of the descending and ascending loops, and the distal convoluted tubule, which will connect into the cortical or central collecting duct. The fluid will move through the kidney in that order, and some will be filtered out and some will be reabsorbed. Only 20% of the plasma that passes through the glomerulus is actually filtered. Less than 1% of filtered fluid is eventually excreted. So most of what gets filtered through the glomerulus will actually be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. The general process for water reabsorption is to follow wherever sodium goes. So sodium is actively transported from tubules into the interstitial space, then into the blood. This causes chloride ions to follow passively, and this movement of sodium chloride into the interstitial space surrounding the tubules will cause water to follow into the blood by osmosis. Reabsorption takes place along the nephron's renal tubules in the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule, but most takes place about 75% of the water in the filtrate will return to the capillaries in the proximal convoluted tubule, and glucose and different minerals will be returned to the blood also. Secretion then, this is the movement of substances from the blood back into the tubules for the purpose of removing it from the body. Common substances that will be secreted are hydrogen ions, potassium, ammonia, urea, and creatinine. And the role of secretion is to control blood pH levels, excrete nitrogenous wastes, and also filter out any unwanted drugs. Urea is a nitrogenous waste product made by the liver. Nitrogenous wastes are initially brought to the liver as ammonia, which is a chemical compound of nitrogen so toxic that it should not remain in the body without harming the cells. So the liver removes ammonia from the blood and converts it to a less harmful substance called urea, which will enter the bloodstream, travel to the kidneys, and will then be excreted. The proximal convoluted tubule then begins at the glomerulus, the tubular pole of the renal corpuscle. The cells will reabsorb almost all the nutrients leaked through the filtration membrane. It absorbs water, sodium, glucose, amino acids, and these molecules will be reabsorbed into the peritubular capillaries, which surround the proximal convoluted tubule, and take them back into blood circulation. The nephron loop then projects into the medulla and contains two parts, the descending and ascending limb. The descending limb is permeable to water, and the ascending limb is not permeable to water. One hint, if you're listening, that things in red are probably important. Both limbs facilitate reabsorption of water and solutes. The ascending limb helps to reabsorb sodium and chloride, and this forces water to move with it due to the osmosis gradient. They will then be returned to the blood system via the vasa recta capillaries that surround the nephron loop. The nephron loop functions to help concentrate the urine, and it's responsible for about 7 milliliters of reabsorption. And the distal convoluted tubule contacts the afferent arterial wall at the vascular pole. It's lined with simple cuboidal epithelium. It secretes potassium and hydrogen from the peritubular capillaries into the tubular fluid. About 12 milliliters is reabsorbed in the DCT part, and it will respond to ADH and aldosterone by increasing water reabsorption and increasing sodium reabsorption. The collecting ducts then, the distal convoluted tubule leads to the collecting duct, and this collecting duct projects through the renal medulla toward the papilla. It's kind of the last chance to alter any filtrate or reabsorb any nutrients, and about 5 milliliters per minute is reabsorbed in the collecting ducts. Antidiuretic hormone secreted by your posterior pituitary gland is secreted when there's low blood volume or low solute concentration. This helps to regulate the blood, causing the collecting ducts to become more permeable to water, which leads to an increased reabsorption of water back into the blood and a decrease in urine production. If ADH is inhibited, it leads to an increase in urine production and less water reabsorption in the case of alcohol consumption. The collecting tubules and ducts, how tubular fluid becomes urine. The distal convoluted tubules lead to collecting tubules that empty into collecting ducts, which will course through the medulla toward the renal papilla. Collecting ducts will modify tubular fluid under the influence of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Higher levels of those hormones lead to retention of sodium and water. And once the tubular fluid leaves the collecting duct, it is urine. The collecting duct empties into the papillary duct that opens into the minor calyx, which will lead into the major calyx, which will lead to the pelvis. Calyxes in the pelvis are all lined with transitional epithelium. And this is a good review of the parts of the nephron and their functions. So I'd encourage you to kind of pause the PowerPoint and read through this part. So this is a review of the functions of the nephron. This is a great slide to kind of just review what we all talked about. So pause the video and just kind of read through these to make sure you understand what happens in each of these parts. Innervation of the kidney, it's innervated by the renal plexus, which accompanies the renal artery and enters the kidney at the hilum. Pain from the kidneys is usually referred to those T10 to T12 dermatomes. The parasympathetic role is unknown, but the sympathetic role, most kidney function is under sympathetic control. And that is urine and urine samples. At least 500 milliliters of urine must be eliminated every day because this amount of fluid is needed to remove potential toxic materials. It estimates that the kidneys filter about 180 liters of fluid daily. A normal adult eliminates 1.5 to 2.3 liters of urine a day. This usually depends on the amount of water intake and sweat loss. Purified blood then will be returned back to the circulatory system through the renal vein. Urine is mostly water. The rest is uric acid and creatinine, which are different waste products. The major waste product is urea, which is that product of the liver metabolism and the conversion of amino acids. It's toxic to cells and must be removed. And it usually has a yellow or amber color due to its pigments. Urobilinogen is produced by bacterial action on bilirubin in the intestines. It's delivered to the liver by the hepatic portal vein and then to the kidney to be removed. So that's what gives urine its yellow or amber color. Abnormal findings on a urinalysis, any change in pH, the average is about 6, elevated proteins, sugar shouldn't be detected normally, but it is sometimes in diabetes. Ketones, which is an excess breakdown of fats, shouldn't be detected, but again, is sometimes in the case in diabetes. Bilirubin shouldn't be found in urine. It's caused by the breakdown of red blood cells. White blood cells, if they're found in urine, it's usually a sign of infection. Blood in the urine is usually a sign of kidney stones, infection, a blood disorder, or kidney damage. And if you find crystals in your urine, that's usually a sign of kidney stones. The ureters then, each of the 2 ureters is a fibromuscular tube that conducts urine from a kidney to the urinary bladder. It originates at the renal pelvis at the hilum of the kidney, and it will enter the base of the urinary bladder at its posterior lateral wall. The wall of the ureter has 3 layers, the mucosa, the muscularis, and the adventitia. There's 4 tunics or layers that form the wall of the urinary bladder: the mucosa, the transitional epithelium. It has urugae, the muscular folds, which allow for further distension or stretching. The submucosa, the muscularis, is the layer of smooth muscle, collectively called the detrusor muscle, and a thickened internal urethral sphincter is present at the urethral opening, and the adventitia is the outer layer of the areolar connective tissue. Micturition is the process of expulsion of urine from the bladder. It's controlled by what we call the micturition reflex. Extension or stretching of the bladder will excite its stretch receptors, which signal the spinal cord's reflex center. Parasympathetic signals are sent to the internal urethral sphincter to relax it, and the detrusor muscle to excite it, but voluntary relaxation of the external urethral sphincter is required to actually expel the urine, and the abdominal muscle contraction also helps to empty the bladder. The urethra then is a fibromuscular tube. It originates at the urinary bladder and conducts urine to the exterior of the body. It's lined with mucin, producing cells. It has smooth muscle to help propel the urine. And there's 2 sphincters that help to control the release of the urine. The internal is involuntary and the external sphincter is voluntary. The female urethra transports only urine, but the male urethra has urinary and reproductive functions that we'll talk a little bit about in the next chapter. And it's partitioned into these 3 segments: the prostatic, going through the prostate gland, the membranous urethra, and then the spongy urethra. Its opening is called the external urethral orifice. And that's the end of the urinary system. We just have one more chapter to go. Thanks for listening, guys.